In a small town in Texas, a mother's worst nightmare came true, a nightmare that would forever change the lives of her family. Officer Sarah Collins, a dedicated police officer, had just wrapped up another grueling shift. Exhausted, she was looking forward to a peaceful evening at home with her loved ones. But what Sarah didn't expect was that when she stepped into her home, she would be forced to make a split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. That Sarah's husband, Ethan, worked long hours at a nearby hospital, and their 17-year-old daughter, Mia, was supposed to be at home with Sarah's father, Frank, who had been staying with them for a while. Frank, a man who had always been a supportive grandfather, had been helping out with Mia while Ethan and Sarah juggled their busy schedules. But this night, something wasn't right. Stick around to find out what happened next, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more shocking stories like this one. Let's dive right in today as Sarah parked her car in the driveway. She couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. It had been a long shift, traffic stops, domestic disputes, and a pile of paperwork that seemed to never end. Her shift was over, and all she wanted was a quiet evening with her family. Sarah had always found comfort in the familiar sights of her home, the two-story house on Maple Street with a creaking oak tree in the front yard. It was a place where her husband, Ethan, and their 17-year-old daughter, Mia, waited for her at the end of each day. But as Sarah reached the front door, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. The door was slightly ajar, a rare and unsettling sight. They had always been a family that locked up tight, too careful, too cautious to leave anything to chance. So why was the door open? A cold shiver ran through her. The peaceful evening she had anticipated began to feel distant. She called out for Mia and her father, Frank, but only silence answered. The house seemed too quiet, too still. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of police work, clicked into overdrive. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. She stepped forward cautiously, calling again, but this time her voice sounded far too small in the emptiness. The air in the hallway felt thick with tension, as if something was waiting just out of sight. Then she heard it, a faint sound, almost too soft to catch, coming from upstairs. The unmistakable noise of movement. It was coming from Mia's room. A feeling of dread settled in her gut. As a police officer, Sarah had been trained to handle dangerous situations, to read the signs before things escalated. But in this moment, there was no training that could prepare her for what she was about to face. Her hand instinctively moved to rest on her holstered weapon. Every step up the stairs was deliberate, cautious. The closer she got, the louder the sounds became, a low murmur, followed by the creak of bed springs. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened, the urgency rising with every step. She had to know what was happening, and fast. Something in the pit of her stomach told her this was no ordinary night. As Sarah reached the top of the stairs, her heart was pounding in her chest, each beat seeming to echo louder than the last. She hesitated at Mia's door for just a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The sounds from inside grew clearer now, muffled voices, hushed whispers. One was unmistakably Mia's, shaky and uncertain, but the other? That voice was all too familiar. It was Frank's. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened, a cold sweat breaking out across her brow. Her father, what was he doing with Mia? She pushed the door open, every instinct screaming at her stop, but her body moved as if on its own, compelled by a force she couldn't control. What she saw would be burned into her memory forever. Frank was sitting on the edge of Mia's bed. His hand was on her thigh, and Mia's eyes were wide with fear, frozen. Her body tense, as if every muscle was fighting to keep still. Her face was a mass of confusion, her lips trembling. The moment Sarah's gaze locked on the scene, her world shattered. Shock slammed into her chest like a physical blow, the raw betrayal hitting deeper than she ever thought possible. This was her father, the man who had been there for her through thick and thin, the man who had played the role of a caring grandfather to Mia. He had been trusted with the most precious part of her life, and now he had violated that trust in the worst way imaginable. Anger surged through Sarah, sharp and unforgiving, and it didn't matter that this was her father. This was her daughter, her baby girl, in danger. The rage was immediate, instinctual, and terrifying. Without thinking, her hand moved her side, drawing her weapon in a fluid motion. Her voice cracked as she demanded, "Get away from her." The words barely left her lips before she realized her finger had already tightened around the trigger. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence of the room. Then another and another, until the sound of gunfire filled the space between them. 4 shots, each one sealing the fate of the man she had once called father. Frank fell lifeless, his body slumping to the floor as Mia's terrified sobs filled the room. Sarah didn't hesitate. She rushed to her daughter, pulling her into her arms, tried to shield her from the horrific scene they had just witnessed. The smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, but all Sarah could focus on was the shaking body in her arms. Mia was safe now. But for Sarah, everything had changed. The room seemed to stop spinning for just a moment, and in that space of pure chaos, Sarah's eyes locked onto Frank, her father, who had once been a trusted presence in their lives. His face was filled with shock, his eyes wide as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He tried to speak, to explain, but nothing could justify the betrayal Sarah had just witnessed. With a coldness she didn't recognize, her hand moved instinctively for her service weapon. "Step away from her," Sarah demanded, her voice trembling with fury and disbelief. Frank's eyes widened and he opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah didn't wait. There was no time for explanations, no room for words. Only the deep, primal instinct to protect the life of her daughter, her one and only priority. The first shot tore through the room with deafening force, followed by another and then another. Each bullet echoed in her ears, louder than the last. The final shot rang out, and Sarah's finger loosened from the trigger. Frank crumpled to the ground, his body falling lifeless to the floor. Blood pooled beneath him, a stark contrast to the stillness that now hung in the air. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Mia sat frozen on the bed, her wide eyes staring at the body in front of her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The horror of what had just occurred seemed too much for her young mind to process. Her body was stiff with fear, trembling uncontrollably, and Sarah could feel her heart break all over again. Without a second thought, Sarah rushed to Mia, pulling her close, wrapping her arms around her as tightly as she could. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice strained with raw emotion. "You're safe. You're okay." But the words fell hollow, even to Sarah's ears. How could Mia be okay after this? After everything they had just witnessed? As Sarah held her daughter, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The flashing lights of the approaching police cars painted the room in fleeting shades of red and blue. Officers were coming. The world outside was about to crash into their shattered reality. But for now, in this moment, Sarah held onto her daughter, her protector, her child, her reason to survive. The wail of the sirens was soon replaced by the buzz of frantic voices, footsteps pounding up the stairs. Officers poured into the house, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Sarah felt as though she were watching everything happen from a distance, her mind still reeling, trying to process what had just occurred. The air was thick with tension as she tried to steady her breath, clutching Mia to her chest, refusing to let go. "Officer Collins," someone said, their voice cutting through the haze. "What happened here?" "We need a statement." It was Detective Thomas Holloway, his face tense as he stepped into the room, his eyes flicking the body of Frank on the floor. He was one of the senior detectives, and Sarah recognized the seriousness in his gaze. He'd seen it all, crimes, deaths, violence, but this was something different, something personal. Sarah's throat tightened. How could she explain the unthinkable? How could she make anyone understand the desperation, the instinct, the need to protect her daughter? But the questions kept coming. Was there a warning? Had she considered any other options? Her mind couldn't focus long enough to piece the answers together. She could only think of Mia, the look on her daughter's face, the terror in her eyes, the way she had frozen in place. Detective Holloway's voice was softer when he turned to her. "We need to take a statement. Sarah, we'll get through this, but we need the facts." His words were professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying empathy, the understanding. She nodded, her heart heavy. I shot him. I didn't have a choice. He was hurting her." Mia, still in Sarah's arms, buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her sobs quiet but heavy. Sarah's heart broke for the pain her daughter was enduring. But she couldn't leave her side. Not now, not ever. The room around her was buzzing with activity. But her focus remained solely on Mia, who clung to her like a lifeline as the investigation began to unfold. Sarah was placed on administrative leave. It was standard procedure for any officer involved in a shooting, but the weight of it pressed down on Sarah, heavier than anything she had felt in years. Detective Emily Roberts was assigned to investigate Mia's case, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the sting of it. Her daughter's trauma being analyzed, dissected by strangers. But even as the cold, clinical nature of the investigation started to take over, Sarah couldn't bring herself to care. Her only priority was Mia. She needed to protect her daughter from the storm that was about to engulf them both. Mom. Mia's voice was shaky, her words barely audible. Sarah hugged her tighter, trying to find comfort in the warmth of her daughter's presence. "I'm here, Mia," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this. Together." The minutes dragged on as Sarah held Mia, her body rigid with the weight of the situation. The house, once a safe haven, now felt foreign, suffocating. Police officers moved through the rooms, collecting evidence, taking statements, but Sarah couldn't focus on any of it. Her mind kept returning to Mia, to the trauma etched across her daughter's face. Then, the front door opened. Sarah's heart stopped. She knew that sound. Ethan had arrived home. His face fell as soon as he stepped into the living room, his eyes taking in the scene. Officers, the body of Frank, the blood on the floor. It all hit him like a wave, and for a split second, Sarah could see the shock in his eyes before his expression tightened, hardening into something she couldn't quite read. What happened?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. He stepped forward, his gaze moving from the officers to Sarah, his hands instinctively reaching for her, as if he needed to make sure she was still there. "The truth?" "Ethan," Sarah began, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. How could she explain? How could she tell him that his father-in-law, her father, had been hurting their daughter? I shot him, Ethan. I caught him with Mia. He was..." Sarah's words trailed off, choked by the magnitude of the pain, the betrayal. How could she tell him that she had killed her own father to protect their daughter? Ethan stood still for a moment, his face pale, his chest rising and falling, as if he couldn't quite take a breath. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, he wrapped his arms around Sarah, holding her tight. "Sarah, we're going to get through this. We'll face this together. You did what you had to do to protect Mia. We're a family, and we'll deal with this, no matter how hard it is," Ethan murmured, his voice steady, but there was no mistaking the weight of his own heartbreak in the words. Sarah clung to him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. But even as he reassured her, she couldn't shake the guilt that twisted in her gut. She had acted out of instinct, out of the overwhelming need to protect her daughter. But what had it cost them? The family she fought so hard to build was now fractured, the foundation of trust shattered in an instant. Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands cupping her face. "We'll make it through this. We'll figure it out." But Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. She felt the walls closing in. How could she ask for forgiveness? How could she explain the horror she'd lived through, the horror Mia had lived through? As the investigation progressed, the tension between them grew. Ethan, despite his reassurances, couldn't fully understand the depth of what Sarah had just gone through. He was trying to hold the family together, to support her, but there was an unspoken divide between them, a space filled with unasked questions and emotions neither one of them knew how to address. IT was a heavy burden, one that Sarah could feel weighing on their marriage. The guilt of her actions shooting Frank, her father, the man who had helped raise her, was unbearable. And yet at the same time, she had to hold on to belief that she had done the right thing. But every time she saw Ethan's worried face, every time she felt the strain in their conversations, the guilt gnawed deeper. Would their marriage survive this? Could they survive this? She wasn't sure. But she knew, more than anything, that Mia needed them both. And that was the only thing that kept Sarah from breaking completely. The days after the shooting felt like a blur. The house was quieter now, and Sarah found herself going through the motions, talking to investigators, answering questions, and trying to hold it all together for Mia. But inside, she was a wreck. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of her father, lifeless on the floor, replayed in her mind. Detective Holloway came by that afternoon, his face serious as he sat down across from Sarah. His voice was professional, but there was an underlying sympathy that made it harder for Sarah to breathe. He asked her to walk him through the events leading up to the shooting, and though she had already recounted it once, her voice trembled as she spoke. "I came home early. I didn't feel right. Thought I was getting sick," Sarah said, her hand shaking as she wiped away an invisible tear. The door was ajar. That's when I heard voices coming from upstairs. My father's voice. And Mia, I thought something wasn't right. Her words felt like they were being ripped from her, each one dragging the weight of 1,000 emotions with it. Detective Holloway didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, taking notes, and Sarah could hear the quiet sound of his pen scratching against paper as he asked more questions. Questions about the night, about her father's history, about Mia. "And did you have any reason to believe your father might have been involved in any inappropriate behavior?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had trusted Frank, trusted him with everything. He had been her father, her protector. He had been there for Mia. But the truth crashed into her like a wave, and it almost knocked the breath out of her. "And oh," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, "I never saw any signs. If I had, I would have stopped him. I would have seen it." The guilt that surged through her was suffocating. How had she missed it? How had she allowed Mia to be alone with him? The shame was unbearable, and as she sat there, she felt the walls closing, tightening around her. She had failed her daughter. She had failed to see the signs. The investigation moved forward quickly. The media picked up the story, and soon, Sarah was at the center of a storm she couldn't control. News outlets ran constant updates on the case, speculating about the circumstances, questioning Sarah's actions, and whether she had been justified in shooting her father. The judgment from the outside world felt like an unending weight pressing down on her chest. Then came the grand jury. As the legal process began, Sarah found herself facing not only the legal system, but also the court of public opinion. The questions in her mind became louder, more insistent. Did I do the right thing? Was this all my fault? Could I have saved Mia another way? And worse, had I missed something? Was this abuse always there, hiding behind the man I had loved for so long? As Sarah faced the grand jury process, the isolation became harder to ignore. The strain between her and Ethan grew deeper with every passing day, as both of them were haunted by their own thoughts. For Ethan, the shock of learning that his father-in-law had betrayed them so terribly weighed on him. For Sarah, the guilt was all-consuming, and no amount of comforting could lift it. In the midst of it all, the community's whispers followed Sarah everywhere. Some sympathized with her, understanding that she had acted out of love and protection for Mia. But there were others, voices that questioned her, judged her without knowing the full story. The weight of the media and public scrutiny gnawed at her, making it feel impossible to escape the noise. But the truth remained. Sarah had acted to protect Mia. Even as the investigation loomed and the questions continued, Sarah clung to that truth, trying to find solace in the hope that, somehow, it would be enough. But the pain, the betrayal, and the guilt were relentless, and Sarah knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Sarah sat in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts scattered and her body exhausted from days of questioning, investigations, and sleepless nights. She had hoped that the worst was behind her, but the phone call that morning from Officer Jack Morgan proved otherwise. He had been one of the few officers who didn't treat her like a criminal in the aftermath, and Sarah always found comfort in his steadiness. But today, his voice carried an edge of urgency she hadn't expected. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," Jack said, his tone more serious than she had ever heard it. "Some things have come to light about your father." Her heart clenched before he even explained. She knew, in that instant, that the news wouldn't be good. Frank's betrayal of Mia wasn't the only dark secret buried in the past. "Several women have come forward," Jack continued, his voice lowering. "They've been talking to Detective Roberts. They're saying your father abused them years ago, back in the 80s. They saw the story on the news and decided it was time to speak up. We're still piecing things together. But it's not just Mia." The words crashed over Sarah like a tidal wave. Her father, Frank, had been a predator for years. A man she had once trusted with everything. The shock, the horror, the betrayal all blended together in a single, overwhelming wave. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but it felt like the ground had slipped out from under her. How could she have been so blind? How could she have never suspected? But then, beneath the weight of her grief and disbelief, something else began to settle in, a strange, unsettling sense of vindication. She hadn't been wrong. She hadn't been paranoid or overly protective. She had done the right thing. When Sarah had pulled her weapon on Frank, when she had shot him to protect Mia, she had acted in the only way she could. The knowledge that there had been other victims, that Frank's abuse was a pattern, confirmed everything she had feared but hadn't fully realized until now. She had saved Mia. In that one moment, when her daughter's safety was threatened, Sarah had done what she had to do. And now, hearing that Frank's history of abuse wasn't an isolated incident, that he'd been hurting others for years, made her feel like she had been right all along. The truth had finally come to light, and Sarah felt an overwhelming, complicated mixture of relief and pain. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't paranoid. She had protected her child from a man who had hurt others, too. Still, the weight of what that meant crushed her. She had lost her father, the man who had been a part of her life for so long. She had pulled the trigger, and now, the full scope of what that meant was becoming clearer. But for Mia, it had all been worth it. As difficult as it was to accept, Sarah knew she had made the only choice she could. And now, at least, Mia wouldn't be alone in her suffering. The world was starting to understand the monster Frank had truly been, and Sarah had been the one to stop him and the days that followed. Sarah could feel the tension growing between her and Ethan. Their relationship, once built on years of trust and shared experiences, now felt fragile, strained by the weight of everything they had just endured. They both carried the burden of guilt. Ethan, for not noticing the signs of abuse earlier, and Sarah, for not protecting Mia sooner. The unspoken question loomed between them. Asterisk, how could we have missed this? Their conversations were clipped, awkward. They both tried to put on a brave face for Mia, but the cracks in their relationship were becoming harder to ignore. Ethan would reach for Sarah's hand in quiet moments, his touch gentle, but the distance between them seemed endless. They had both been thrust into a nightmare, and the grief was something they had yet to navigate together. Late one night, as Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, Ethan joined her, the weight of everything in his expression. "Sarah, I should have known," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I should have seen something. I could have protected her, too." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she reached for his hand, trying to reassure him. "No, you didn't know. We didn't know." But the guilt didn't go away, no matter how many times they said the words. The emotional scars ran deeper than either of them could express. Their marriage wasn't the same anymore. The bond they had once shared, unshakable and strong, had been cracked. It would take time neither of them felt they had, to rebuild it. Then came the moment they had both been waiting for. The grand jury had made its decision. Sarah sat in the living room, her stomach in knots, waiting for the phone call. When it finally came, she picked up the receiver, her breath held. "Sarah," Detective Holloway's voice was calm, steady. "The grand jury has decided not to indict you. There won't be criminal charges for the shooting." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Relief flooded her chest like a sudden rush of air, and she sat down hard on the couch. No charges. It was over, at least in a legal sense. Her heart raced, her thoughts whirling. She wanted to cry, to let the weight of it all break free. But instead, she just sat there, frozen. She had been cleared, but the emotional aftermath was far from over. Sarah found Ethan standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with quiet hope. Without a word, she stood up, walking into his arms. They held each other in silence, the relief palpable, but there was no denying the toll this had taken on both of them. The world might have found its conclusion to the case, but for Sarah and Ethan, healing was still a long, uncertain road. Mia, too, was struggling. The therapy sessions were helping, but the trauma had left an indelible mark on her. Sarah and Ethan did their best to be there for her, but the pain lingered in all of them, unseen, buried just beneath the surface. For Sarah, the relief of the grand jury's decision didn't erase the images of that night. The fear in Mia's eyes, or the haunting memory of her father's betrayal. The guilt remained, the regret for not noticing sooner, the shame of what had happened to their family. But Sarah held on to one thing. She had done what any mother would do to protect her child. And though the scars would take time to heal, she knew she would carry that truth with her always. For now, at least, she had her family. And in this new, broken world, that was enough that Sarah's journey toward healing was far from over. The emotional wounds, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of betrayal would stay with her for years. But through it all, one thing remained clear: her unwavering commitment to Mia. She had faced the unthinkable, had made a decision that no mother should ever have to make. And though the world outside might never fully understand, Sarah knew deep down that she had done the right thing. She would continue to fight for her daughter, to ensure that Mia would heal and hold on to the love and protection she had always provided. The road ahead was long, filled with challenges neither of them could have predicted. But Sarah was resolute. She would stand strong for Mia, no matter what. The consequences of that fateful night were painful, but Sarah understood that her strength would carry them both through. And with every step, she grew more certain of one thing. Nothing, not even the darkest of days, could take away her ability to protect her family. The past would never be forgotten, but Sarah was ready to face the future, with her daughter by her side. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and the soul. Thank you for watching.